Welcome. My name is Father David Hollenbach, and I'm the director of the Center for Human Rights and International Justice here at Boston College, and I want to welcome you to this commemoration of the 25th anniversary of the assassination of 6 Jesuits and 2 women who worked with them at the University of Central America in San Salvador on December 16th, 1989. Just a few days ago was the actual 25th anniversary. John Sobrino, who is a Jesuit who would have also been killed had he not been out of the country of El Salvador at the time that the assassinations took place, described the work of the Jesuits in El Salvador this way. He said it was not only a question of alleviating poverty, rather it was about changing the structures of an antagonistic world, structures that were dividing the world between those who were impoverished and those who impoverish others, between those he called victims and those he called executioners. The challenge the Jesuits in El Salvador raised to this structural division of that society cost them their lives. But their blood helped end the civil war in El Salvador that took the lives of many tens of thousands of peasants. Economic division and high homicide rates, unfortunately, continue to wound El Salvador today. But the 6 Jesuits and the 2 women killed with them made a major contribution to peace and justice in El Salvador by helping to bring the civil war there to an end. And so tonight in this commemoration, we remember their courage and we have deep gratitude for their commitment. Both the courage and the commitment can be inspirations to us. I want to thank the co-sponsors of tonight's event, who are co-sponsoring this along with the Center for Human Rights and International Justice. In particular, the Ignacio Martin Baró Fund, which is named for one of the murdered Jesuits from El Salvador. The Martin Baró Fund sponsors organizations working for the same goals as did the Jesuits in El Salvador. And you can pick up a copy of their newsletter at the back of the room on leaving. We're also very grateful to the Jesuit Institute, to the English Department, and to the Latin American Studies programs here at Boston College for their support for our event this evening. Our speaker tonight is Carolyn Forché. Carolyn Forché is a professor of English and poetry at Georgetown, where she also directs the Lannan Center for Poetics and Social Practice. She's widely known as a poet who bears witness to the struggles of those afflicted by human rights violations, by oppression, and by war. The realities that wound the lives of far too many people in our world today. Carolyn Forché is the author of 4 books of poetry. In 1977, while translating the work of the Salvadoran exiled poet Claribel Alegría, she received a Guggenheim Fellowship that enabled her to go to El Salvador. Many of the poems in her second book, The Country Between Us, focus on the Salvadoran conflict and the human rights situation in that country. And we will hear from her about some of her experience in Salvador this evening. For this work, The Country Between Us, she received the Poetry Society of America's Alice Faye de Castagnola Award. And this and her other books led in 2013 to Carolyn Forché winning the Academy of American Poets Fellowship for Distinguished Poetic Achievement, placing her on the same list with other major poets like Gwendolyn Brooks, Ezra Pound, and E.E. Cummings. She has also edited 2 collections of poems on the struggles of war and oppression, one entitled Against Forgetting, 20th Century Poetry of Witness. And then the other one, the just published book, The Poetry of Witness, the Tradition in English. Several of her books are on sale at the back of our room, and you can buy them there, and she will be happy to autograph them for you after this evening's session. And Carolyn Forché is currently working on a memoir dealing with her work for human rights in El Salvador, in Lebanon, in South Africa, and elsewhere. How did a poet become a human rights activist? In a recent short reflection, Carolyn Forché put it this way: when presented with the possibility of going to El Salvador, she said, "I had a crisis of conscience. My friends all said, 'You have a Guggenheim. You should go to Paris and write poetry, or at least go to New England.'" She said in her memoir, her little brief essay, "I remember praying a great deal. Why El Salvador? I knew," she said, "that a door was being held ajar for me, and that if I didn't walk through it, I could never again tell myself that I would have liked to have gone to the Peace Corps, or that I was willing to do something for God, or that I was willing to work for the poor, or that I was willing to put myself at risk. I would realize that I would never again be able to say those things because I had been given the chance and had said no if I chose not to go. That is the only reason," she wrote, "that I went to El Salvador." Well, tonight I'm sure that we will be grateful that Carolyn Forché went to El Salvador and said yes to the chance to encounter the people there. She will help us commemorate the assassination of the Jesuits there by addressing for us tonight the topic, A Poet's Journey from El Salvador to 2014, Witness in the Light of Conscience. So join me in welcoming Carolyn Forché.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, particularly on this occasion. About a year ago, I received a message from Father David Hornbach when he was visiting Georgetown. He invited me to the Jesuit residence, and we had a lunch, and he proposed that I come here today. So he welcomed me, and he made all of this happen. I'm grateful to him also for taking care of some of the introductory work that I might have had to do about going to El Salvador when I did. I was 27 years old, and I was teaching at San Diego State University. I had gotten back from a summer in Spain working at the side of Claribel Alegría, who opened my eyes for the first time and through her poems to conditions in Central America. She was writing about desaparecidos, the disappeared, people who had been murdered and tortured and imprisoned. And I, of course, as a 27-year-old North American, didn't understand how to translate these poems. And my command of the language, which was, I would say, admittedly weak, was not the real problem. The real problem had to do with my previous education and my sensibility. The doorbell rang in San Diego when I was home alone. I had joined Amnesty International. I was furiously writing letters, polite letters, to dictators around the world asking them to please release their political prisoners. And I was grading my freshman compositions. And I wasn't expecting anyone. I had heard about one of Claribel Alegria's relatives. He was kind of mysterious to people. He was very engaged with campesino, farm worker, rural labor organizations. And so they had talked about him quite a lot. His name was Leonel Gomez Vives. Leonel Gomez Vives would become a very close friend of Monsignor Romero, and later of your representative Joe Oakley, and many other people who were deeply involved in the final negotiations of a peace settlement. But you're going to hear a little bit about Leonel Gomez Vives when he was very young tonight. I'd like to take you back to that time. Some of the material that I'm going to share with you comes in the form of poetry, and some in short passages of prose selected from the memoir in progress. Some of it is difficult, and I apologize for that. But I want to take you back there so that you will feel a bit what it was like then. Between 1978 and 1980, I made several long trips to the country, initially to translate Salvadoran poets whose work bore poignant witness to repression, at times so explicitly that it was difficult to distinguish literal from figurative truth. The brutality of the security forces, uniformed and clandestine, intensified during my initial visit, which corresponded to the first human rights investigation in El Salvador. This was conducted by Father John Dryden, also a Jesuit, also of Massachusetts. I observed the proceedings and the remove of one who finds herself assimilating unprecedented horror while encountering living faith for the first time. When the investigators left, I remained and asked my Salvadoran friends what would happen to the campesinos who had commended their dignified, tearful testimonies to the tape recorders, the priests and nuns who had so courageously provided meticulous documents of repression. Most of them will die, my friend said, but they must be protected. Yes, they should receive protection, but from whom? Over the next months, I traveled throughout the country, compiling a report on the growing repression, replete with pseudonyms and detailed atrocities, which I sent to Amnesty International's International Secretariat in London. A few weeks later, I received a reply, couriered from the United States, asking me to continue providing information, particularly regarding the possible fates of the disappeared. For this work, it became necessary to learn to compare a child's photograph with the face of a mutilated corpse, to search without prospect of recovery, and to impart hope without feeling hopeful. In this, I was continually accompanied by Salvadorans who guided me with patience through the labyrinthian military security state, permitting me to discover for myself my own embassy's complicities. They were with me when I feared more for myself than for others, when I wanted respite or the comforts of home. Within months, I could no longer regard my fate as other than inextricably tied to their own. I would like to give you the scene from when I first met Father Echecuria in El Salvador. This takes place in early 1978. That day, I met two of the Jesuit priests, Father Ignacio Echecuria and another, one of his colleagues. But in the intervening years, I have forgotten who the other priest was. I also met a scholar, Ricardo Stein, who was developing a center for documentation at the university and who invited me to come and talk with him. Father Echecuria, wearing a white guiabera instead of a cassock, motioned for us to sit in the chairs facing his desk. That day he had pushed his glasses onto his forehead as if he had eyes there. His gaze was fixed and intense, his language precise, and he began to speak in a manner reserved for visiting guests, as he did for students at the UCA. But when he was told that I was in El Salvador on a fellowship, he assumed that I knew much more than I did. And so his efforts that day fell on less fertile ground than he may have supposed. That day, he most wanted to talk about a recent law decreed by the government, the Law of Defense and Guarantee of Public Order, or what people seem to refer to simply as the law. It prohibited rebellion, the hosting of meetings to discuss rebellion, the encouraging of members of the armed forces to disobey orders, attempts by spoken or written word to oppose the established order, and everything having to do with opposition to the military regime. There was also a provision having to do with the National University of El Salvador. This was across town, which had been placed under a special body to assume temporary responsibility for governance, given the present climate of unrest and violence on the campus. I took notes as best I could, and later my friend Margarita would show me a copy of this law, with its 11 categories of offenses, its punishments, procedures, and articles, the whole of it placed at the disposal of the first chamber of criminal matters, and so on. This means, Margarita said, that they can arrest anyone at any time for any reason. They have legalized their repression. It is against the law to oppose them in any way. But Carolina, only the lucky ones are arrested under this law. Only the lucky ones have a trial. We were talking in the dark after the girls went to bed, Margarita's 3 daughters who were schoolgirls then. What happens to the unlucky? What happens? They are disappeared. They become desaparecidos. We don't know. The next day we climbed into the clouds above the city because she wanted to show me something. All that day we went places together, to the empty gray cathedral with no pews, to the Human Rights Office with its red and gray tiled floor, folding chairs and blue walls, where she showed me photograph albums, some with daisies on the cover, where the photos of the disappeared were mounted on sticky pages covered with plastic. Most of the photographs of the disappeared had been taken at school, or on some occasion, such as completion of nurses' training, a 15th birthday party, a wedding engagement. Therefore, most of the photographs were of young people, even if at the time they disappeared, some were no longer young. This sometimes makes it difficult, Margarita said, to match the photographs of the disappeared to the dead that we find. But there are other factors making identification difficult as well. In the Human Rights Office, these albums and some folders were stacked high on the table. There was a telephone and a fan turning side to side. People came and went, mostly older women. It was possible to tell which among them was new to the office, as they appeared desperate and anxious, clutching photos and scraps of paper, while others stared listlessly, waiting as if for some news. I turned the plastic pages to study the faces, and it was like looking through the yearbook of a class who would never be seen again. I wrote as many names as I could in my notebook, not knowing yet what I would do with them. No one stopped me from copying these down. A woman waiting even crossed the room to bring me another album from the table, nodding as she pressed it into my hands. Before we left, Margarita pointed to a particular photograph and asked me to remember the face. I will tell you later, she said, when we're alone. The photograph of the woman I asked you to remember, she was my friend. The last time I saw her, we were in a bank, standing in line at a teller's window. This was some time ago. She was dressed up, so maybe she was on a break from work. I'm not sure. but she was pale and seemed nervous, alert like a perico, one of those small birds you see flocking at dusk. She would barely speak to me, and we were once close. She was looking all around us, over my shoulder, out toward the bank entrance, and then she said in a low voice I almost couldn't understand, "You must get away from me. You must pretend not to know me, please." And then she said, "I love you, and I will see you again someday." I said I loved her too. The next week, I think it was, she disappeared somewhere near the market. I didn't sleep well after that, and I kept imagining where she might be and what they might be doing to her. In Cavafe's poem, Theodotus, a severed head is brought into a tidy house. The bodies we come upon here are bloated, partly eaten by carrion birds and stray dogs. If the corpse is missing an arm, we don't find the arm. The arm is gone. If the corpse is missing genitals, it is the same. The eyes are eaten first as soft tissues. The carrion birds seem to prefer them. We are lying side by side in the dark, one on each of two twin beds. Margarita is smoking a cigarette. "I am going to tell you about Lilia," she whispers, "what they did to her." We have gone to El Playón for the first time. We park the jeep and walk. It is very early morning and no one is there. Before stopping, Lionel made sure there were no other vehicles, so we were alone, but he often said, "Don't be too sure." There was a loud hum of flies. There were many turkey buzzards hopping around and sometimes rising a few feet from the ground before landing again. None flew. There was a stench of rot, and so I held my sleeved arm to my face. Lionel passed me a handkerchief. He seemed not to need one for himself. "Be careful," he whispered. Of what, I wondered. I seldom knew when he said this what being careful would entail. We drove a well-graded but unpaved road walled in banana palms. On both sides of the road there were new electrical posts and lines. The posts were short, no more than 12 feet high, and the heavy lines were many strung between them. "Do you notice anything strange?" Lionel asked. As usual, when he asked such questions, I was silent, but I did look closely into the palms to see if there was something other than trees. We passed a small roadside stand piled with coconuts, but that wasn't unusual. "The electricity," he finally said, to give me a hint. "Notice that there are no lines going from the poles anywhere else. They are not going into the little hamlets you don't see behind the palms. They are strung along the road, and that's all." I had learned that further elaboration would come more quickly if I didn't ask anything. "And that's where I'm taking you this morning," he said. "We're going to where the electricity is going, to see where it winds up." One morning, Lionel arrived on a small motorbike. I didn't yet know how much such bikes meant to him. That as a young man he had tinkered with them, raced them, even set a line of trophies on a shelf in his house because of them. But this morning he had borrowed this one and we were setting out. Later that day, a small military helicopter would suddenly appear in the sky above us as we were driving through the narrow streets and alleys of a barrio. Lionel made many turns, but the helicopter held to the air above us. And as I realized that we were possibly being pursued, Lionel drove into a garage and killed the engine. "I have no idea," he said, "but it's time to get off the streets." So here we were in a machinist's repair shop with the parts of an engine set in rows on a blanket. "Now let's go," he said. "We have to get out of here, too." I'm lying on the floor between twin beds, listening to the cries of a woman coming from the next house. She is screaming, begging, she is desperate. Are they interrogating her? In the morning, I discovered that a parrot perched in a mango tree had been making these cries. Later, I would compare things to this. Like a parrot crying in a grove of mango. Where did the parrot learn that? The doctor gives me the tour first, as if I were a visiting inspector or an official from an invisible delegation. She lifts sheets from sleeping patients and shows me their bodies, half-clothed, emaciated, hard of breath, listless in their beds, and so on. She shows me her supply closet, nearly empty, the stack of tin cooking pots, the ragged rubber nipples set to dry on a serviette, waiting to rejoin the steaming glass baby bottles. The cook fire nearly gone out. The surgery with its single metal table and standing lamp. The high, loud hum of flies coming in through the louvers. I published some poems in a book called The Country Between Us. This was published in early 1982. And one of the poems was called The Visitor. The Visitor was written for a prisoner in Ahuachapan. Ahuachapan, which later became a military barracks, was at that time a men's prison in the town of the same name. And there were many political prisoners mixed in with criminal prisoners in Ahuachapan. Leonel Gomez Vidas knew one of these prisoners and also knew the warden because he'd gone to grammar school with him. And so he made arrangements with this warden. He told the warden that I was an old friend of this prisoner and could I please come and visit him. I didn't know the prisoner. I wasn't sure what was going to happen. And Leonel said, do you want to do this? And I said, okay. How long do I have inside? He said, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes. This is how the prison was. It's not in the poem, The Visitor, which I'll read to you in a moment. The stench came first, like the stench of rotting coffee husks mixed with human waste. The hot stench of blood and the sharpness of urine lifting from the pails that lined the hallway. There was an odor of humans, together with the smell of smoke from the many small braziers. What were they? Little cans punched with holes, holding a few burning coals, and over them men were heating their rations of beans and tortillas. The prison had 4 sides and an open courtyard. The hallways on the 4 sides were open to this yard, so the odors and cook smoke could lift toward the sky. But the smell still hung in the air. I put the Fanta orange drink that Miguel had given me to my nose, and he smiled and nodded. That is what the Fanta was for, not to drink, but to have something else to smell. The men filled the courtyard, lined on all 4 sides, squatting on the tiles or sitting with their backs to the wall and their legs outstretched. When I walked through the hall, some of the men pulled their legs in to make way for me, and some didn't. Some had tucked newspapers into the rims of their straw hats, and these hung down over their faces and all around their heads. They were wearing little newspaper tents for privacy. They were all wearing their own clothes, not prison uniforms, but rags, really, filthy garments that had been torn and pocked with holes. Miguel was walking, and I was beside him. In there is where we sleep, he whispered, pointing to a room that appeared to be lined with wooden shelves. Those are the barracks. This place was built to hold about 200 men, but there are twice that number here now. He stamped the tile floor with his crutch and kept moving. Here are the latrines, don't go in there. There was something odd. No one was looking at me. As I approached, they turned their faces away or looked down or at each other. Only Miguel looked at me, and he was quiet too. When we were outside in the beginning, I could hear a din of voices and shouts and even laughter coming from inside, but now nothing. Here are the workrooms. We were in a long room with wooden benches now. The walls were concrete block, painted aqua, and I didn't see any tools or other evidence of work. We turned a corner. There was a group of guards there, gathered in a circle, playing a game with dice, thoroughly occupied with the game, tossing dice and laughing or groaning. No one looked at us. We had made almost a full circle of this courtyard on all four sides. Miguel seemed to be looking around somewhat furtively. "Listo," he whispered. "Are you ready?" He looked at me directly and asked if I saw the dark, open doorway near us. I did. It was not quite 10 feet away, a room with an entrance like the barracks, like the workroom, on the other side of the courtyard, the far side. "No one is paying attention to you now. Just walk into that room and try to see what you can. Don't stay very long, and control your face when you come out. I'll be right here. If anyone sees you and asks what you're doing, just make an absent-minded North American lady face." And he imitated such a face by looking at me blankly with his mouth slightly open. I had never seen anyone do that before. I never realized that this is what we looked like to others. And just say you got lost. For a moment I felt paralyzed, and then he smiled and nodded yes to me and tossed his head in the direction of the doorway. "Go now, quickly." I was inside the room. It was darker than any other place I had been in the prison, and it stank more. I tried to adjust my eyes to the darkness. "Try to see," Miguel had said. It was what Lionel was always asking me to do. Try to see. What I saw were wooden boxes about the size of washing machines, or maybe a little smaller. I counted the boxes. There were 6 of them. They had small openings cut into the fronts of them with chicken wire mesh over the openings. They were padlocked. As I stood there, some of the boxes started to move a little, and I realized there were men inside them. Fingers came through one of the mesh openings. Blood rushed to my ears. I stood there and tried to orient myself so that I could know not only where this room was, but also which wall the boxes were against. Then I walked slowly toward the light of the open doorway and then quickly into the hall where Miguel was standing against his crutch. I came toward him and he whispered, "Tie your sweater sleeves around your neck. You have hives." I get hives. Not as often as I once did, but in childhood frequently. Whenever I was afraid or nervous or sad, they bloomed on my neck and face, so I did as he asked and tied the sweater sleeves. That's la oscura, the darkness, solitary. Sometimes men are held there for a year and can't move when they come out because of the atrophy of their muscles. Some of them never recover their minds. Tell them on the outside, tell them. And then raising his voice, he said, "Carolina, it was very nice to see you again. Give my love to Ana and Carlos." He was walking again, whispering, "Mil gracias. It's time for you to go now. Go," he said, motioning with his head toward the gate. "Will you be all right?" "Como no?" he said, "Go." So this is the poem I wrote for him. It's called The Visitor, and he had gotten married while he was a prisoner, but he had never been able to be with his wife. In Spanish, he whispers, "There is no time left. It is the sound of scythes arcing in wheat, the ache of some field song in Salvador. The wind along the prison, cautious as Francisco's hands on the inside, touching the walls as he walks. It is his wife's breath slipping into his cell each night while he imagines his hand to be hers. It is a small country. There is nothing one man will not do to another." I call him Francisco in the poem, and I call him Miguel in the memoir. But his real name was Ricardo. We all had a bunch of names. Everybody had a lot of different names. The names changed all the time, and sometimes you knew a person by a different name than other people knew them by. This is a documentary poem. This is the first one that has real difficulty for me. It has an obscenity in it. I think it has 2 obscenities in it, but the Federal Communication Commission of the United States only thinks there's 1. And the thing they think is that there's a 4-letter word in it that can't be pronounced on National Public Radio. Although the first time I read this on National Public Radio, they didn't anticipate this word. And so it was the last time this word was ever pronounced on National Public Radio. Now they beep it. They're waiting for me. They know this. So this is the poem. Some of you may know this one. The Colonel. What you have heard is true. I was in his house. His wife carried a tray of coffee and sugar. His daughter filed her nails. His son went out for the night. There were daily papers, pet dogs, a pistol on the cushion beside him. The moon swung bare on its black cord over the house. On the television was a cop show. It was in English. Broken bottles were embedded in the walls around the house to scoop the kneecaps from a man's legs or cut his hands to lace. On the windows there were gratings like those in liquor stores. We had dinner, rack of lamb, good wine. There was a gold bell on the table for calling the maid. The maid brought green mangoes, salt, a type of bread. I was asked how I enjoyed the country. There was a brief commercial in Spanish. His wife took everything away. There was some talk then of how difficult it had become to govern. The parrot said hello on the terrace. The colonel told it to shut up and pushed himself from the table. My friend said to me with his eyes, "Say nothing." The colonel returned with a sack used to bring groceries home. He spilled many human ears on the table. They were like dried peach halves. There is no other way to say this. He took one of them in his hands, shook it in our faces, dropped it into a water glass. It came alive there. "I am tired of fooling around," he said. "As for the rights of anyone, tell your people they can go fuck themselves." He swept the ears to the floor with his arm and held the last of his wine in the air. "Something for your poetry, no?" he said. Some of the ears on the floor caught this scrap of his voice. Some of the ears on the floor were pressed to the ground. San Salvador, May 1978. Sometimes in the countryside, you will come upon a tree that has been decorated with strips of paper, rags, and garbage. This is because the tree failed to bear fruit in its good year. The people tie things to the tree to make it feel ashamed, to embarrass it in front of the other trees, so that the next year fruit will come. One day in the Campo, in an area where there had been some killings, there was a tree with skin and hair hanging from its branches. It looked like rags and garbage. The soldiers who had done this were from the Campo. They knew what it meant to hang things on a tree. There was a couple of labor leaders killed in Salvador, Michael Hammer and Mark Proman. And with them, they were always named in the American press as Michael Hammer and Mark Proman. 2 labor advisors, Michael Hammer and Mark Proman, but they would never name the Salvadoran man who was killed with them. His name was Jose Rodolfo Vieira, and he was a campesino labor organizer. Because one is always forgotten. When Vieira was buried, we knew it had come to an end. His coffin rocking into the ground like a boat or a cradle. "I could take my heart," he said, "and give it to a campesino, and he would have to cut it up and give it back. You can't eat heart in those 4 dark chambers where a man can be kept years." A boy soldier in the bone-hot sun works his knife to peel the face from a dead man and hang it from the branch of a tree, flowering with such faces. The heart is the toughest part of the body. Tenderness is in the hands. There was a Monsignor, now Monsignor Romero, another one. This one was named Monsignor Uriastre. He was a friend of Monsignor Romero, and he used to take me for walks and talk to me, mostly about what was going to happen when the revolution was over. I was walking beside Monsignor Uriastre, a quiet, studious priest whom I knew as a friend of Monsignor Romero. The weather on this day was white, the sky as yet unbroken by the rains, and we were somewhere near the unfinished cathedral and the plaza where vendors sold holy cards, ice cream, and open sodas from stalls that closed with rippling security gates for a few hours in the afternoons and also at night. Monsignor Uriastre walked calmly but with long steps, and it was hard to keep up with him. We had been talking about the views of the religious community toward the armed struggle when he suddenly fell silent. His hand made the gesture of patting a child's head, but he was patting the air between us as if to say, slow down, or wait, or be quiet. He had stopped walking and had fixed his gaze on the street ahead of us. I tried to see what he was seeing, but saw only the traffic. Stop and go traffic, brightly painted buses with their black exhaust and sacks tied to their roofs, cars nosing behind them with windows down and radios blaring. The voice in the commercial was calling out, Domingo, 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 and then the cacophony of horns, voices, motor scooters, and the softer bells of bicycles died down. The cars had stopped too, many of the drivers now seeing what Monsignor Uriastre saw. A windowless van had stopped just ahead of us, and men were leaping out of the back. Two of them grabbed a young man from the street who was wearing a student's backpack and wrestled him into the vehicle. Everyone stopped or moved away from where they had been walking, some ducking behind the buses, and right beside me a security gate was suddenly pulled down, ringing as it slammed into the walk. Monsignor Uriastre crossed himself as others around us disappeared into alleys and shops. There was a stillness, and then the van peeled away with such a scream of tires that the sound stayed in the air after the van could no longer be seen. We must pray for that boy, Monsignor Uriastre said. This was the first and only time I witnessed an abduction, the moment when someone is made to disappear, to become desaparecido. Before and after this, I would search for them in the body dumps, in the morgue, and along the beach, would study their faces in the photographs provided by their families, most of them photographs taken in school, and ask questions of these mute faces. Are you alive? Where are you? What have they done to you? And I would make promises to these silent faces, most of them younger than myself, that I would find them. Leonel Gomez died in 2009, a week after we all attended the 20th anniversary of the deaths of the Jesuit priests. Leonel was very fat when he died because everyone copes with stress differently. Some people smoke cigarettes, some people chew their nails. Leonel coped with stress by eating ice cream, and he ate quite a quantity of ice cream in his life. So while most of us, did you know this, our ashes, if we are cremated, weigh 5 or 6 pounds. Leonel's weighed a lot more than that. We went back, all of us, we had come back to the United States, so we flew back to Salvador to have a funeral for him and to carry him up the Wazapa volcano, where most of the war had been fought by the groups that he was familiar with. And there's something that happened on that volcano. And unlike the night of the colonel with his bag of ears, I was some kind of military bounty, we had cameras with us, cell phone cameras. We took pictures of this one. So there's 100 pictures of this thing that happened. Ashes to Wazapa. Your cinerary box was light, but filled with you it weighed 8 pounds. Nevertheless, we each wanted our turn carrying you up the mountain. We passed the roofless chapel, the crater, the graves of the youngest, the camping place, the secret paths, the impossible stone road. We came upon the shivering trees where the magical foreign doctor was said to dig out bullets with a penknife and supply the children with iron by dipping rusty nails in water. We came upon the past where the holes were dug, and if you dug there now, you'd fill quite a sack with bones. We don't stop to dig there. We carried your box to another place, not as far as we would have liked, but far enough, where we all had our pictures taken with you, and then your box posed with your former truck that will now belong to the priest you saved from prison. The truck seemed to know what had happened. We spent a long time piling stones around the trees. Even the mayor, who was once a fighter himself in these hills, piled stones. Then with cupped hands, we tossed your remains into a coppice of cedars. You flew a little. Your soft ash flew, settling on the stones under the trees. A camouflage moth alighted on the tree where most of you fell, and there your friend worked his machete until a cross appeared, and then within it, a Christ of sap and grain. The moth then vanished into the jacaranda, and dragonflies arrived, hovering. Then from nowhere, butterflies rained into the coppice, blue mariposas, as they sometimes do, into the roofless chapel. And as dragonflies whirred above us, the camouflage moth held still with its wings open, and the mariposas rose and fell until all was dust and wings, you in flight, leaving a life without a day not given to others, leaving us who stand in your sunlit clearing of butterflies and ash. After he died, I started writing for the first time in 30 years, more than 30 years, about El Salvador again. Somehow I couldn't do it for a long time. And I told you a lot about looking for bodies. There was one body that stayed with me for years, and I would sometimes dream about this one. And I never wrote it, and I thought, why can't I write this? I want to write this. After Lionel died, it just poured out. And this is also something that has a difficult thing in it. And I'm going to stop with this and have questions, okay? This is called The Ghost of Heaven. Zopilotes are carrion birds. I think they're turkey buzzards in English. But that's the only Spanish word in the poem. And Lionel's voice comes into the poem because he wants me to bring some things with me when I come. And the ghost of heaven. Sleep, to sleep through 30 years of night. A child, herself with the child, for whom we searched. Through here, there, amidst bones still sleeved and trousered, a spine picked clean, a paint can, a skull with hair. Night to night, child walking toward me through burning maze, over the clean bones of those whose flesh was lifted by Zopilotes into heaven. So that is how we ascend, in the clawed feet of fallen angels, to be assembled again in the workrooms of the clouds. She rose from where they found her, lying not far from a water urn, leaving herself behind on the ground where they found her, holding her arms before her as if she were asleep. Walking through a fire-lit river to a burning house. Dead singer, sewing machine, and piece of dress. Outside a cashew tree wept blackened cashews over lamina. Outside, paper fireflies rose to the stars. Bring penicillin if you can, you said. Surgical tape, a whetstone, mosquito repellent, but not the aerosol kind. Especially bring a syringe for sucking phlegm, a knife, wooden sticks, a clamp, and plastic bags. You will also need a bottle of cloud for anesthesia, to sleep like the flight of a crane through colorless dreams. When a leech opens your flesh, it leaves a small volcano. Always pour turpentine over your head before going to sleep. Such experiences as these are forgotten before memory intrudes. The girl was found, don't say this, with a man's severed head stuffed into her where a child would have been. No one knew who the man was, another of the dead. So they had not, after all, killed a pregnant girl. That sound in the brush, a settling of wind in sorghum. If they capture you, talk. Talk, please. Yes, you heard me the first time. You will be asked who you are. Eventually, we are all asked who we are. All who come into the world, all who come into the world are sent. Open your curtain of spirit. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this extraordinary presentation of ashes and butterflies, both beautiful. Thank you. So Carolyn will now accept some questions or observations from you all, and she can acknowledge those who would like to speak.
I didn't read everything because I think it was too long, but it was kind of a collage of different experiences. And I'll answer anything if I can. Yes, yes.
I don't know if this was like an introduction, I missed it, but okay, so I'm in the global practice, like the macro for social work, so I hope to travel a lot in my career after I graduate. So what exactly was it that inspired you to go here? Like, was it something that you wanted to specifically go for poetry, or was it just like a burning desire? Was it just like a dream, or like a spirit? Like what was it that led your path?
The man who invited me was Leonel, who was a nephew of Claribel Alegría, a poet. He wanted a poet. He knew the war was coming. He told me it was coming in 3 to 5 years. He said it was probably inevitable, although he worked tirelessly to try to prevent it from happening. And he thought a poet should see this. That's what his motivation was, because he thought after the war came, then the poet could go back to the United States and, explain to the Americans what the conditions were that gave rise to the war, and then the Americans would understand. And then the Americans wouldn't approve military aid. You see, this was his reasoning. So I explained to him how Americans view poets, because Latin Americans don't view poets the same way as North Americans. And so I told him, I sent him a list about things like, beatniks and mental hospitals and things like that were sort of a fringe element. And he said, well, really? He said, we take our poets very seriously. Sometimes we put them in prison, but we take them seriously, or we send them to diplomatic posts. He said, those are the two options for poets in Latin America. But he said, if that's the case, you're going to have to change that. And I thought, this man is really quixotic. I don't know why I went. I think I've tried to articulate it before. I went because I was invited, and I did not think the war was going to come. I did not know anything about where I was going. I had never seen that kind of injustice or poverty. I thought I was going to improve my Spanish. I thought I was going to have a cultural experience. I thought I was going to invent my own Peace Corps version of the Peace Corps. That's what I thought I was doing. And it turned out to be that I was in El Salvador in 1978. So it turned out differently. But I didn't know what was going to happen. I would like to think that I would have gone anyway if I knew. I'm not sure about that really, because it was really a frightening time. This was the time of the death squads before the war started. The death squads were two. There were the civilian death squads who were run by, what's his name, the dentist? Oh God, I'm glad I blocked it. But Dawisong and, what was the dentist's name? Anyway, well, they called him dentist. He wasn't really a dentist. They were civilian death squads. They were on the right. They were paid by some of the oligarchs. And then there was the military that was operating death squads within their own ranks and units. So they were, by the time I left, they were killing maybe 1,000 people, or disappearing 1,000 people a month. And those are civilians. We're talking about priests, nuns, doctors, school teachers, activists, organizers, students, lots of students. And so that was a very scary time to be in any part of the country, but in the capital, what they were trying to do was eliminate the people who were working with the poor. They thought if they eliminated everyone who was working with the poor, this would all be over. You know, that if they killed enough, you know, people who cared about the poor, this would all just go away. But they kept killing and killing and killing, and more people stood up and more people joined. And what was happening in the countryside, you should know, which was very beautiful. This is why the people in the countryside, the campesinos, this is what happened. They were forming little groups. They were Christian-based communities, small groups. They didn't have priests with them most of the time. There weren't very many priests to go around. So they had what they call lay catechists, which were people who would go and meet with them and carry communion to them. But late at night, little candle, read one verse of scripture and talk about it for 2 hours, you know, and everyone would gather around and have this conversation. What does this scripture mean to our lives now? How do we interpret it? What are we going to do? And it was like there's a poet from the French Resistance called Robert Desnos, and he says, for the earth is a camp lit by thousands of spiritual fires. So I like to think of those years with all those little candles and all those little champas, you know, with everybody gathered around reading each a little verse and talking about it, because that's how the people awakened. It was through that. It was not in my mind, that was my experience. They knew who Carlos Marx was, but they were very interested in their own community, their fellowship, their responsibilities to each other, you know, their commitments to each other, their awakening of conscientization, of conscience and consciousness at the same time. I don't want to go on too long about this because probably most of you know this, but that's how it happened. And in the capital, they were killing sort of middle-class people a lot, you know, who had professions, who were committed to barrios and poor communities. That's my memory. That's what I saw. That's what I experienced. And that was the early time before the war. What else? Yes, in the back.
Thank you so much for the excellent presentation. My question has to do with, you are dealing really with dangerous memories, the memories that really provoke us and sit us and make us uncomfortable. I'm wondering to what extent your writings also offer some hope. To what extent does your writing or your poems give hope that after all these dangerous memories, there is also a good life to live, especially now that it is 25 years after. And the hope that also can provide solidarity between those who suffered, but also those who were doing well during the time of the crisis. So that brings the victims, but and the perpetrators. That's my question. Really has to do with hope. After what you have written, I see a lot of
Monsignor Romero told me to, he said, you know, we're none of us going to get to see the end of this. We only come out and we do our part in our time, in our lives. We live each moment as ethically and beautifully as we can, with as much love as we can. And someone else will come after us. And we don't have to worry about how it's going to end, because we're not going to see the end, you know, in our lifetimes. And so he said, you don't have to, he said, if you worry too much about how you must feel toward these things, you might get discouraged and tired. And you don't want to get discouraged and tired. So we regarded it as a daily practice, moment to moment. But I will share some thoughts of Father Eyakuria with you that I learned from Father Eyakuria. He taught that each moment of our lives is a test of our whole lives, and that while we are not always responsible for what befalls us, we are certainly responsible for our response. And in this lies our capacity to meet the moment beautifully and in a manner that honors our deepest aspirations for what it means to be a human being. Father Eyakuria believed that the university should be the critical and creative conscience of the society, and the three branches, teaching, research, and what he called social projection and what we call service, should go beyond the committees of the departments and the colleges, go beyond service to the institutions itself to encompass service to the world. He taught that the university's success should be measured by what percentage of its students might be deemed likely to contribute positively to the future of the world. It's a little bit different language than return on investment, you know, but that's a phrase I don't like to use. But my hope it doesn't, it's just every moment, you know, and it's about what we can do, what kind of work we can do, what kind of, in the classroom, anywhere. It doesn't have to be in a dangerous situation, you know. My youth was shaped by dangerous situations, but, you know, I'm not in the habit of getting into dangerous situations now, because I'm old. I don't know if I would handle it as well. Is there any other question? Yes. Claudia, right?
Claudia.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you. Thank you for being here. I was curious about just kind of, again, more about self-care, how you manage self-care in terms of hearing hard stories, writing about hard experiences. So that's one of my questions. And then my second question is just kind of like going through these experiences and having like this incredible witness with people who are suffering. I'm wondering if like you could shed any insight. I'm curious about your thoughts of what's happening with Ferguson here.
Did they make any announcement?
No, I don't think there's been any announcement. So I just was kind of curious about your thoughts regarding that.
Okay, number one, so, you know, there were a lot of people, I saw a lot of cruelty and a lot of violence in Salvador, but I also saw the most radiant human beings on earth there. I felt like I was surrounded by people who would give their lives for each other, readily, absolutely. I'd never experienced that before. And it gives you a kind of spiritual protection in a way. And that protection stayed with me, you know, all this time. I was with Monsignor Romero a week before he was assassinated. We were in the convent kitchen at Divine Providence, and it was clear that he was in grave danger. I spent my last evening with him trying to persuade him to leave. Well, he was not going to do that. He said, no, you're going to leave. However, he said, now my place is with my people, and now your place is with yours. And I thought, I have a people? I mean, we don't think in those same terms, and that's interesting, isn't it? But he was afraid. He wasn't self-caring. He wasn't helping. He wasn't protecting himself. he always carried this Bible with him, and he would always just tap on it with his hands. And he was scared, but he was also filled with a kind of light, and he was calm. You could even laugh at jokes that night. Those nuns always told a lot of jokes, and he was very, in a way, lighthearted and full of love and full of light, and yes, afraid, because it's frightening, So for me to see that and to be around those people, even for the time I was, it changed everything. It changed everything for me to know that that was possible. And now once you see that something's possible, you see it everywhere. Now I can see it. There are lots of people in this country like that too. The people in Ferguson have been very brave. Ferguson is a shameful thing. I was in Ireland when it happened, and the cab drivers in Ireland were asking me, when they found out I was American, they said, "What's going on? What's going on there?" The whole world was watching Ferguson, was watching those police. That everybody should know. It did not make the United States look particularly good. And I said, well, that's a measure of police brutality that is endured by the poor, and particularly by African American communities and people of color, and has been endured for all this time. There has never been a significant change in that, despite illusions about the accomplishments of the civil rights movement and so on. I have a whole speech on that, so I won't give that one today, but I suggest that you go back and read all of James Baldwin, and then that will be very helpful in that regard. Did I answer them? I don't know. I'm really on pins and needles about this grand jury. I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, nobody knows, but yes.
I wondered if this responsibility of the poet and the instructions to come back here and make an impact. Remember when we were there once talking with young people, and we said, "What message would you like us to bring back?" And they said, "Go back to your high school and tell them to end the neoliberal policies that are ruining our country." And it was like,
But
but so I'm curious, Carolyn, about your experiences coming back to the United States, having seen what you've seen, whether there are stories of being completely ignored, or whether there's also stories of being able to really make an impact people.
when I came back, I had been writing poems again. I took refuge in my notebook in El Salvador, especially when I was scared, and I would just write. So I had this book, and it was published, and it was greeted really variously. In fact, it was during the Reagan administration, and it was condemned as a book of political propagandistic poetry. And it was praised by people who wanted that, wanted to read that, but it was attacked a lot, and I was, accused of being a political propagandist. And that's why I went to the library, and I thought, well, wait a minute, because I wrote these poems. Well, what did other poets write who lived through wars, or were exiled, or were in prison, or what did they write? So I went to the library, and I got translations of poets from all over the world, and I especially paid attention to poets who had endured conditions of extremity, from state-imposed violence or the depredations of the state. I was interested in that experience. So yes, warfare, living under house arrest, living under military occupation, severe forms of censorship even. And what I found was that most poets from the 20th century in the world had endured those things. And those that had survived, you could feel that experience in the poems, whether or not they were about their experiences. So I started collecting them together to show to my students, so that they would be exposed to poets from outside this country. Because at that time, people weren't reading poets from other countries very much. And that became the anthology Against Forgetting, which we have here, which is 145 poets writing from 30 languages, from the Armenian genocide to Tiananmen Square. And because Tiananmen Square was the last event before I went to press, it begins with a motto by Bertolt Brecht. In the dark times, will there also be singing? Yes, there will be singing about the dark times. And it ends with another motto by Bertolt Brecht. which is, this then is all. It's not enough, I know. At least I'm still alive, as you can see. I'm like the man who took a brick to show how beautiful his house used once to be. I just loved it, so I've made those bookends in the book. I was asked by W.W. Norton in New York what a poet of witness was, what poetry of witness was. And I had just been talking about it for 45 minutes, so he said, well, tell me what is poetry of witness and how is this different from, for example, Robert Frost. This was a senior editor. So I thought, what am I going to do? I have to tell a story. So I told the story of Miklos Rednoti. In 1944, Miklos Rednoti, from what would become and once was Yugoslavia, was forced marched from Hungary back into, he was from Yugoslavia, he was sent to harsh labor, and at the end of the war, they tried to force march them back into Hungary. 2,000 men. Miklos Rednoti was with these 2,000 men. He had found a notebook somehow. He wrote his last poems on the march. It was winter. 22 people survived the march, along with the soldiers who accompanied them. Among them, the poet, Miklos Rednoti. He was one of the 22 survivors. The German soldiers were impatient. Some speculate they wanted to get back to their units, but they executed these 22 and buried them in a shallow grave. And after the war, Fanny Rednoti, the widow of Miklos, and her fellow villagers were led to the spot where people said the bodies had been buried. And they dug them all up and laid them on the field, and she went from corpse to corpse until she found her husband, identified her husband, went through his pockets and found his notebook, took out the notebook, peeled the pages apart, and dried them in the sun. And I said, those are that's poetry of witness, and I'm going to include them in the anthology, and that's what I mean by poetry of witness. So there was this silence in the room, and they asked me how long it would take for me to finish. So wanting to make sure that this would happen, I said, oh, a year, I could do it in a year. Well, I still had to get all the permissions, and when I was copying them from my students, I didn't mark down where they were all from. So I had to go back and reconstruct everything. It took 3 more years, but I did this as a kind of proof. Okay, poetry can be this. And then this year, my colleague at Georgetown, Duncan Wu, and I published a new one, a second one, 500 years of English language poetry by poets who endured conditions of extremity, and guess what? Almost all of them did. And that's something else. Reading English language poetry against the myth of the ivory tower and the sequestered poet who has nothing to do with the world or social conditions or political situations, almost all of them. Almost all of them. It was quite an interesting thing to discover about my genre and about poets in the world. And I had been told all my life, don't get mixed up with anything. You're a poet, you're an artist, you should be separate, you should be above this should not be part of what you're doing. This is the message. I don't know if you've ever heard this, but I've heard it all my life. And so what was happy for me was getting accused of being a political propagandist enabled me to make the anthology. It was like going to a library to find out about my rare medical condition, which was political propagandist. No, what President Reagan said that I was an unwitting dupe of international communism. I thought, unwitting? Anyway, this was, yes.
This isn't to say in any means that poetry is not enough, because I think that it does so much for social change and social movements. But I'm wondering if there's anything additionally on Georgetown's campus, specifically because that's where you are, that you're pushing towards in terms of appropriate social movements for 2014 that you're in and with your students.
Well, I direct the Lannan Center for Poetics and Social Practice. We are a center for the convergence of literary art, social justice, and human rights. And we have a big group of Lannan Fellows on our campus. We bring writers and public activists and intellectuals from all over the world. And this year we're focusing on what they call climate death. And Bill McKibben will be with us, and we're going to have a major symposium in the spring on a number of issues having to do with environmental degradation. We have had these symposia every spring. They focus on America's involvement in wars. Last spring we focused on Edward Snowden and the NSA surveillance security state. So we have a whole list of things that we do. And I've been really honored to be able to do this work and to have that, that's what I'm doing on the Georgetown campus. But I'm a member of the English department and I teach literature too. So, and I love teaching. Teaching is a very important activity, Some of these Landon Fellows have gone to a lot of places and done things. Most recently, one of them went to South Sudan to open children's libraries in refugee camps. So there's a formation that's happening with these students that's really important. And it's not done by telling them you should do this, you should do that. We just bring people and let them hear, and like those little fires we were talking about. Yeah. Well, it's late, right? I really appreciate your time. Is it late? It's not late. Okay, I take any more? I just got a note here, but I don't mind. Just looking at you, and you have to go out of that cold.
Well, maybe we should call it.
It's getting colder by the minute. I want you to do one thing. Will you do me a favor? I want to say the names, and I want you to say presente, okay? That's what we do, okay? These are the martyrs. Padre Ignacio Echecuria.
Presente.
Padre Ignacio Martín Barón.
Presente.
Padre Segundo Montes.
Presente.
Padre Juan Ramón Moreno.
Presente.
Padre Joaquín López y López.
Presente.
Padre Amado López.
Presente.
Señora Elba Ramos.
Presente.
Señora Celina Ramos.
Presente.
Señorita Celina Ramos. Thank you.